The blinding light of sunrise crept over the eastern rim of the Ruby Mountains, silhouetting Gunnar Walsh as he emerged from the stagecoach that had just arrived in Elko, Nevada. The promise of a new beginning hung in the morning air as heavily as the dust kicked up by the coach wheels. The 18-year-old bride-to-be smoothed down her ash-gray traveling dress, purchased specially for her journey west, and gazed nervously at the small frontier town that would soon be her home. It was 1876, and Elko was still finding its footing as a settlement, having sprung up just 8 years prior when the Central Pacific Railroad established a depot there. The town had grown quickly, fueled by silver strikes and cattle ranching, but to Gunnar's eastern eyes, it still seemed impossibly raw and untamed. She clutched the letter from Jacob Thornton, the man she was to marry. They had corresponded for 6 months after he'd placed an advertisement in her hometown newspaper in Philadelphia seeking a bride. His letters had been kind, thoughtful, and promised a comfortable life on his prosperous cattle ranch outside of Elko. At 29, Jacob had described himself as established but lonely, ready to share his life with a partner. Gunnar had been working as a seamstress since her parents died of influenza 2 years prior. The prospect of marriage, even to a stranger in a distant land, seemed preferable to the grinding poverty and limited options available to her in Philadelphia. She'd answered his advertisement, enclosed a daguerreotype, and after a flurry of correspondence, accepted his proposal. Miss Walsh. A boy no more than 12 approached her. "Mr. Thornton sent me to fetch you. His wagon's just yonder." She followed the boy to a weathered farm wagon where a thin, sour-faced man sat holding the reins. "You're Gunnar?" he asked, not bothering to climb down. "Yes, sir." "And you must be Mr. Thornton. It's a pleasure to finally—" "Get in," he interrupted. "Got a long ride ahead and daylight's wasting." Startled by his brusque manner, so different from his letters, Gunnar allowed the boy to help her with her trunk before climbing onto the hard wooden seat. As they pulled away from the station, she attempted conversation, but Jacob responded with grunts or one-word answers. Hours passed in uncomfortable silence as they traveled away from town, the landscape growing increasingly desolate. The ranch Jacob had described as prosperous turned out to be a dilapidated cabin with a sagging porch and a small corral containing 3 skinny cows. "Home," Jacob announced flatly, pulling the wagon to a stop. Gunnar's heart sank as she surveyed the property, so different from the comfortable homestead described in his letters. Inside, the cabin was filthy, with unwashed dishes piled high and clothing strewn about. "You can start by cleaning up this mess," Jacob said, dropping her trunk in the middle of the floor. "I'll be back after I tend to the stock." That night, after hours of cleaning, Gunnar lay on a thin mattress, fighting back tears. Jacob had returned drunk, eaten the meal she'd prepared without comment, and fallen asleep in a chair by the stove. His letters, so eloquent and promising, had clearly been written by someone else, a deception she now had to reckon with. The next morning, Jacob was sober but no more pleasant. "Pastor's coming tomorrow to marry us," he announced over the breakfast she'd prepared, "and some folks from town. Make sure the place looks presentable." Gunnar nodded, swallowing her despair. She had no money to return east, no family to take her in. She was trapped. That afternoon, as Jacob left to hunt, Gunnar discovered a hidden bottle of whiskey and a stack of letters written in the same hand as those she'd received. They were addressed to a H.L. Franklin, postmarked from Elko. It became clear that Jacob had paid someone to write his letters, creating a fiction to lure her west. The next morning, Pastor Mills arrived with 3 other couples from nearby ranches. Gunnar went through the ceremony in a daze, becoming Mrs. Jacob Thornton before sundown. The small gathering celebrated with a modest meal she'd prepared, and Jacob remained surprisingly sober throughout. As the guests departed, however, Jacob's demeanor darkened. "Now you're mine," he slurred, reaching for her. "Paid good money to get you here." Gunnar backed away. "Please, Jacob. Let's get to know each other first." His face contorted with anger. "Know each other. I own you now." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm roughly. Gunnar twisted away, but Jacob caught her hair, yanking her toward him. In desperation, she grabbed a cast iron pan from the stove and swung it hard. It connected with Jacob's temple with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor. Trembling, Gunnar knelt beside him. He was still breathing but unconscious. Blood trickled from a gash on his head. Panic surged through her as she realized the consequences of her actions. No one would believe her side of the story. She was a stranger here, and he was an established local. Moving quickly, Gunnar gathered what supplies she could find: a canteen of water, some jerky, a blanket, and Jacob's hunting knife. She changed into a pair of his trousers and a shirt, knowing a dress would make travel more difficult. After tying back her long brown hair, she took what little money Jacob had and fled into the night. She had no plan beyond escaping, no destination in mind. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. The night was cool as she began walking in the direction they'd come from town, hoping to reach Elko or perhaps flag down a passing stage. Gunnar had been walking for hours when the smell of smoke reached her. At first she thought it might be a campfire, perhaps travelers she could approach for help. But as she crested a rise, her blood ran cold. In the distance, silhouetted against the night sky, Jacob's cabin was engulfed in flames. Had Jacob regained consciousness and knocked over a lantern in his rage? Had he set the fire deliberately, knowing she'd fled? Gunnar stood frozen, watching the distant inferno, knowing she would now be blamed not just for assault, but likely for arson and perhaps even murder if Jacob hadn't survived. With renewed desperation, she continued walking through the night, pushing herself beyond exhaustion. By dawn, she was disoriented and dehydrated, having finished the small canteen of water hours ago. The landscape was unfamiliar. She realized she must have veered off course in the darkness. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Gunnar's lips cracked and her vision began to blur. She stumbled on, knowing that to stop meant certain death, but each step became more difficult than the last. Finally, her legs gave out and she collapsed on the hard-packed earth. Hank Forrester spotted the figure from nearly a mile away, a dark smudge against the beige landscape that didn't belong. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he drew closer on horseback, he saw it was a person, someone lying motionless on the ground. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. At 32, Hank had learned that caution kept a man alive in this territory. But as he dismounted and knelt beside the still form, he saw it was a young woman, dressed in men's clothing, her face smudged with dirt and what looked like soot. "Madam," he said, gently turning her over. She was unconscious but breathing. Her skin was hot to the touch, a clear sign of heat stroke. Working quickly, Hank lifted her onto his horse and mounted behind her, supporting her limp body as he turned toward his ranch. Hank's property lay 10 miles south of Elko, a modest but well-maintained cattle operation he'd built over the past decade. The main house was solid pine with a wraparound porch, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade in the brutal Nevada summers. By the time they arrived, the woman was stirring slightly. Hank carried her inside and laid her on his bed, then set about treating her as best he could. He bathed her face with cool water, noting the smudges weren't just dirt but ash. There were also small burns on her hands and a cut along her hairline. When he loosened her collar to help her breathe easier, he saw bruises forming on her neck and shoulder, shaped like fingerprints. As he worked, Hank wondered who she was and what had happened to her. Dressed in men's clothing, covered in ash, injured, she was clearly fleeing something or someone. There had been no reports of trouble in town when he'd visited 2 days prior, but that didn't mean much in this vast territory where news traveled slowly. Gunnar awoke to the sensation of something cool and damp on her forehead. She opened her eyes to find herself in an unfamiliar room, lying on a bed with fresh linens. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming, or perhaps she had died in the desert. "You're awake," a deep voice said. She turned her head to see a man sitting in a chair beside the bed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck, and a neatly trimmed beard shadowed his jaw. "Where am I?" Gunnar croaked, her throat painfully dry. The man helped her sit up and held a cup of water to her lips. "My ranch, about 10 miles south of Elko. I found you collapsed out on the flats. You've been unconscious for almost a day." Gunnar drank gratefully, then sank back against the pillows, exhaustion washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Name's Hank Forrester," he said, setting the cup aside. "And you are—" she hesitated, fear flashing across her face. "Gunnar," she finally said, omitting her new surname. "Gunnar Walsh." Hank nodded, not pressing further. "You need rest, Miss Walsh. We can talk more when you're stronger." Over the next 2 days, Gunnar drifted in and out of sleep, gradually regaining her strength. Hank brought her meals, changed the dressing on her head wound, and applied salve to her burns, but asked no questions about how she came to be wandering alone in the desert. On the 3rd morning, Gunnar awoke feeling clearer-headed than she had since her escape. She sat up in bed, noticing a clean dress draped over a nearby chair. It was simple but well made, of soft blue cotton. A knock sounded at the door. "Miss Walsh, are you decent?" Hank called. "Just a moment," she replied, quickly pulling the dress over her head. It was a bit large but infinitely preferable to the men's clothing she'd been wearing. "Come in." Hank entered carrying a tray with breakfast eggs, biscuits, and coffee. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting it beside her. "You're looking better today." "I feel better," Gunnar admitted. "Mr. Forrester, I don't know how to thank you for your kindness." He waved off her gratitude. Any decent person would have done the same. He hesitated, then added, "Miss Walsh, I don't mean to pry, but I should tell you that Sheriff Parker rode out yesterday asking if I'd seen a young woman. Seems there was a fire at Jacob Thornton's place 3 nights ago. Thornton was found inside, dead." Gunnar's face drained of color. "I didn't," she began, then stopped, unsure how much to reveal. Hank held up a hand. "I told him I hadn't seen anyone, but he's asking at every ranch in the area." Tears welled in Gunnar's eyes. "He was going to hurt me," she whispered. "Jacob, I mean. I hit him with a pan and ran, but he was alive when I left, I swear it." Hank sat on the edge of the bed, his expression grave. "Start from the beginning." Through tears, Gunnar told him everything: the letters, the deception, the hasty wedding, Jacob's violence, and her desperate escape. "I saw the cabin burning from a distance," she finished. "I don't know how it started, but I didn't do it." Hank believed her. There was an earnestness in her tear-filled green eyes that couldn't be faked, and the bruises on her neck corroborated her story of Jacob's violence. "Thornton had a reputation," Hank said quietly. "He's tried this before, bringing women out here with promises of a good life. The last one disappeared about a year ago. Most folks assumed she'd run off, but now I wonder." Gunnar shuddered. "What will happen to me? They'll never believe I didn't start the fire." Hank was silent for a long moment. "There might be a way," he said finally. but you'd have to trust me completely." "I have little choice," Gunnar replied. "What are you suggesting? Marriage?" Hank said bluntly. "If you're my wife, it gives you protection, a respectable name. We say you arrived just before the fire, that you were traveling to meet me after corresponding. The fire was visible from town, plenty of people saw it. We say you got caught in it trying to help, which explains your burns and the ash." Gunnar stared at him, stunned. "You do that for a stranger? Risk your reputation, possibly your freedom?" Hank met her gaze steadily. "I've been alone a long time, Miss Walsh. I'm not proposing this solely out of charity. This is a hard country for a single man. I've been considering advertising for a wife myself, but haven't found the courage. This arrangement would benefit us both." "As business partners, you mean?" Gunnar asked cautiously. "To start," Hank nodded. "I'm offering my name, my protection, and a home. In return, you'd help with the running of this place. As for anything more—" He paused, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "That would be entirely up to you if and when you were ready." Gunnar considered his proposal. She had no money, no connections, and nowhere to go. If she refused and was caught, she would likely hang for Jacob's death, deserved or not. And there was something about Hank Forrester, a quiet strength, a fundamental decency that made her believe she could trust him. "Yes," she said finally. "I accept your offer, Mr. Forrester." "Hank," he corrected with a small smile, "if we're to be married, you should use my given name." The next morning, Hank rode into Elko with Gunnar seated behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. They had carefully constructed their story. Gunnar had arrived on the evening stage 3 days ago, expecting to meet Hank in town after months of correspondence. When he failed to appear, delayed by a broken wagon wheel, they would claim. She had accepted a ride from a kindly older couple heading in the direction of Hank's ranch. They had stopped to water their horses near Thornton's property when they noticed the fire. Gunnar, they would say, had rushed to help despite the couple's warnings, suffering burns and smoke inhalation before being driven back by the intensity of the flames. Disoriented, she had wandered away from the scene and collapsed, where Hank found her the next day while searching after learning of her arrival in town. It was a risky tale, relying on the absence of witnesses who might contradict it, but it was the best they could devise. They would need to be married immediately to explain why she would remain at his ranch rather than staying in town while recovering. As they rode into Elko, Gunnar felt eyes upon them. The town was small enough that a newcomer was always noticed, especially one arriving with Hank Forrester, known to be a confirmed bachelor. He helped her dismount in front of a small church, steadying her when she swayed slightly, partly from weakness, partly from nerves. "Ready," he murmured, offering his arm. Gunnar took a deep breath and nodded, placing her hand on his forearm. "As I'll ever be." Inside, they found Pastor Mills, the same man who had married her to Jacob just days before. Gunnar's heart raced, but the pastor showed no sign of recognition as Hank explained they wished to be married immediately. "Miss Walsh and I have been corresponding for some time," Hank said smoothly. "She arrived on Tuesday's stage, but due to unfortunate circumstances, we were only reunited yesterday. Given what she's been through, we'd prefer not to wait." Pastor Mills raised an eyebrow. "Circumstances?" Hank explained their fabricated story, watching the pastor's expression shift from skepticism to concern. "Poor child," Mills said, looking at Gunnar with sympathy. "That was Thornton's place that burned. Terrible business. They found him inside, you know." Gunnar managed to look appropriately shocked. "How awful. We had no idea anyone was inside. The smoke was so thick." "You're fortunate you weren't more seriously injured," Mills said. "Or worse." "Indeed," Hank agreed, squeezing Gunnar's hand. which is why we don't want to waste any more time. Life is precious and uncertain. The pastor nodded thoughtfully. I'll need 2 witnesses. I can fetch Abigail from the general store, Hank suggested, and perhaps Dr. Bennett. He should examine Miss Walsh anyway, given her ordeal. Within the hour, Gunnar found herself once again standing before Pastor Mills, this time with Hank at her side. Dr. Bennett and Abigail Stone, the shopkeeper's wife, served as witnesses. The ceremony was brief but solemn, and when Hank slipped a simple gold band onto her finger hastily purchased from the general store, Gunnar felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. I now pronounce you man and wife, Mills declared. Mr. Forrester, you may kiss your bride. Hank hesitated, then leaned down to place a chaste kiss on Gunnar's lips. It was brief, but she felt a warmth spread through her at the gentle contact. Afterward, Dr. Bennett insisted on examining Gunnar's burns and the cut on her head. These are healing nicely, he pronounced. But you've had a shock to your system, Mrs. Forrester. Plenty of rest and good food for at least a week. The new name startled Gunnar, Mrs. Forrester. It would take some getting used to. As they left the doctor's office, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached them. Forrester, he nodded. This your new wife I've been hearing about, Sheriff Parker, Hank acknowledged. Yes, this is Gunnar. The sheriff studied her intently. Heard you were at Thornton's place when it caught fire. Gunnar's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Yes, sir. It was terrible. I tried to help, but the flames. What time was this exactly? Parker asked. It was after dark, she replied, sticking to their rehearsed story. Perhaps 9 o'clock. The couple who gave me a ride had stopped to water their horses nearby. And these people, they saw you try to enter the burning building. Hank stepped in smoothly. They advised against it, from what Gunnar has told me. Elderly couple passing through. They left her to find help after she was injured, but she became disoriented from the smoke and wandered off. Parker frowned. Convenient that these witnesses aren't around. Sheriff, Hank said firmly, my wife has been through a terrible ordeal. Dr. Bennett has ordered rest. If you have further questions, they can wait until she's recovered. The sheriff looked between them, his expression unreadable. I'll be out to your place in a few days, Forrester. I want a full statement from both of you. As the sheriff walked away, Gunnar leaned heavily against Hank, suddenly exhausted. He doesn't believe us. He's doing his job, Hank said quietly. Come on, let's get you home. Home. The word sounded strange to Gunnar. She had left one home to marry a stranger, only to find herself married to another stranger days later. But as Hank helped her onto his horse and mounted behind her, his strong arms encircling her waist as he took the reins, she found herself hoping that this time might be different. The next week passed in a blur of adjustment for Gunnar. True to his word, Hank was respectful of her space and recovery, insisting she take the bedroom while he slept on a cot in his study. He was often out working the ranch during the day, but returned for meals, which they took together at the large oak table in the kitchen. Slowly, Gunnar began learning the rhythms of ranch life. She took over the cooking and household tasks, finding comfort in the routine. Hank's home was well built and comfortable, with a parlor, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and his study. It was simply furnished, but clean and well maintained, a stark contrast to Jacob's squalid cabin. Hank, she discovered, was a man of few words but considerable kindness. He never pressed her for details about her past or her brief marriage to Jacob, seemingly content to let her reveal things in her own time. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. It's beautiful here, Gunnar remarked one evening, a week after their hasty wedding. Hank nodded. That's why I stayed. Came out west with nothing but a horse and the clothes on my back when I was 19. Worked every job I could find until I had enough to buy this land. Been building it up ever since. You've done well, she observed. The ranch is impressive, he shrugged modestly. It's not the biggest spread, but it's good land. Plenty of water, decent grazing. Gets mighty lonely, though. The admission hung in the air between them. Gunnar studied his profile in the fading light, the strong jaw, the straight nose, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and perhaps of laughter. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I know our arrangement is unusual." Hank turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. "Gunnar, I want you to know something. I meant what I said about this being your decision. If you ever want to leave, go back east, start fresh somewhere else, I won't stop you. I'll even help you get where you want to go." Touched by his sincerity, Gunnar found herself reaching for his hand. "I appreciate that. But for now, I'd like to stay. I made a commitment to you, and I intend to honor it." His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he released her hand. "Sheriff Parker will be coming tomorrow," he reminded her. "We should go over our story once more." The next morning, Sheriff Parker arrived as promised, his expression grim as Hank invited him into the parlor. Gunnar served coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set the cup before the lawman. "Mrs. Forrester," Parker began without preamble, "I've been making inquiries about your arrival in Elko. Stagecoach driver remembers you well enough, says you were met by a boy who took you to Jacob Thornton's wagon." Gunnar's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't recall a boy, Sheriff. As I told you in town, an elderly couple offered me a ride when my husband didn't meet the stage as planned." Parker's eyes narrowed. "That's strange, because Thornton's neighbor says he saw a woman matching your description at Thornton's place the day before the fire. Says there was a wedding." Hank stood abruptly. "Sheriff, what exactly are you implying?" "I'm implying, Forrester, that your wife here was married to Jacob Thornton, and now Thornton's dead, his place is burned to the ground, and she's suddenly Mrs. Hank Forrester." Parker fixed his steely gaze on Gunnar. "Care to explain that?" The silence in the room was deafening. Gunnar looked from the sheriff to Hank, whose face had gone pale. Their carefully constructed story was unraveling, and with it, her chance at freedom and a new life. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was married to Jacob Thornton." "Gunnar," Hank began, but she shook her head. "It's time for the truth, Hank." She turned back to the sheriff. "I answered an advertisement Jacob placed seeking a bride. His letters were kind, promising a good life. When I arrived, I discovered he'd lied about everything. The prosperous ranch was a filthy shack. The gentle man from the letters was a violent drunk." Parker's expression didn't change. "Go on." "We were married the day after I arrived. That night he tried to." Gunnar swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "He tried to force himself on me. When I resisted, he became violent. I struck him with a cast iron pan in self-defense. He fell unconscious and I fled. And the fire, I saw it from a distance as I was walking toward town. I don't know how it started. Perhaps a lantern fell when Jacob came to, or maybe he set it himself in rage. But I didn't start it. I swear on my life." Parker studied her for a long moment. "And how did you come to be Mrs. Forrester so quickly after being widowed?" Hank stepped forward. "That was my doing, Sheriff. I found her collapsed from heat stroke and brought her home to recover. When she told me what had happened, I offered marriage as protection. I believed her story then, and I believe it now." "Convenient," Parker remarked. "It's the truth," Gunnar insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant for Jacob to die, I just wanted to escape." The sheriff sighed heavily. Thornton did have a reputation, and his cabin was a tinderbox waiting to happen, especially with his drinking. He stood, adjusting his hat. "I can't prove you started that fire, Mrs. Forrester. And if what you say about Thornton's violence is true, which, knowing the man, I'm inclined to believe, then striking him was self-defense." Relief washed over Gunnar, but it was short-lived. "However," Parker continued, "there's still the matter of your marriage to Forrester here while already being wed to Thornton." "That's bigamy, madam." "No, it isn't," Hank countered. "If Thornton was already dead when we married, then she was a widow, not a bigamist." Parker considered this. "True enough, but it looks mighty suspicious, the two of you marrying so quickly after her first husband's death." "We can't control what it looks like," Hank said firmly, "only what it is. And what it is a legal marriage between two consenting adults after the death of her previous husband." The sheriff put on his hat. "I'll be watching you both," he warned. "Any hint of trouble and I'll be back with more questions." He nodded curtly to Gunnar. "Madam." After he left, Gunnar collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry, Hank. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Hank sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You have nothing to apologize for." She looked up at him, her eyes red. "I should have told you everything from the beginning." "You told me what mattered," he said simply. "The rest was just details. But now everyone will think the worst of me, of us." Hank shook his head. "People will talk for a while, then something else will come along to gossip about. That's the way of small towns." He paused, then added softly, "Unless you want to leave, the offer still stands." Gunnar considered his words. She could leave, start fresh somewhere else where no one knew her story. But the thought of leaving Hank, this kind, decent man who had risked everything to help her, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to leave. If you'll still have me, I'd like to stay and try to make this work. Our arrangement, I mean." Something flickered in Hank's eyes, relief perhaps, or something warmer. "I'd like that too," he said. As summer gave way to fall, Gunnar and Hank settled into a comfortable routine. She took to ranch life with surprising ease, learning to manage the household, tend the kitchen garden, and even help with some of the livestock. Hank taught her to ride properly, and soon she was accompanying him on short trips around the property. Their relationship remained chaste, with Hank continuing to sleep in his study despite Gunnar's offers to trade places or find another arrangement. "You need proper rest," he insisted. "The cot suits me fine." But something was changing between them. Gunnar found herself watching Hank as he worked, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he chopped wood, the gentle way he handled even the most stubborn livestock, the smile that transformed his serious face whenever she mastered a new skill. For his part, Hank seemed more relaxed in her presence. He spoke more freely, occasionally sharing stories from his past, his childhood in Ohio, his journey west, the struggles and triumphs of building his ranch. In the evenings, they would read together by lamplight, or Hank would teach her to play checkers, his deep laugh warming the room when she made a particularly clever move. One crisp October evening, they sat on the porch after dinner, wrapped in blankets against the growing chill. The sky was a tapestry of stars, more than Gunnar had ever seen in the smoky skies of Philadelphia. "It's my birthday today," she said suddenly. "I'm 19. Hank looked at her with surprise. "You should have said something. We could have celebrated properly." She smiled. "This is celebration enough. A year ago, I was working 14-hour days in a dressmaker's shop, wondering how I'd keep a roof over my head. Now I'm here under this magnificent sky with—" She trailed off, suddenly shy. Hank prompted gently. "With you," Gunnar finished softly. "A good man who's shown me more kindness than I thought possible." In the silvery moonlight, she saw Hank swallow hard. "Gunnar," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." Her heart quickened. Yes. When I offered marriage, I meant what I said about it being your choice if things progressed between us, and I still mean that." He took a deep breath. "But I find myself hoping that someday you might want more than an arrangement of convenience. Because I'm finding it increasingly difficult to think of you as just a partner in this venture." Gunnar felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cool night air. "Hank," she said, reaching for his hand, "I haven't thought of this as just an arrangement for some time now." His fingers interlaced with hers, strong and calloused. "No, no," she confirmed, shifting closer to him on the porch swing. "I've come to care for you a great deal, more than I thought possible after everything that happened." Hank's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Gunnar?" Properly this time. In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, the kiss tentative at first, then deepening as she responded. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Hank admitted, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "Why didn't you?" Gunnar asked. "I needed to be sure it was what you wanted, that you weren't just feeling obligated because of our arrangement." She laughed softly. "For a man so confident in most things, you can be remarkably uncertain about matters of the heart." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "I haven't had much practice." "Neither have I," Gunnar confessed, "but I think we're doing all right so far." That night, for the first time, they shared the bedroom, though Hank, ever mindful of Gunnar's comfort, insisted on sleeping atop the covers until she was ready for more. As she drifted off to sleep with his arm draped protectively around her waist, Gunnar marveled at the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment of contentment. The winter of 1876–77 was one of the harshest on record in northern Nevada. Snow blanketed the Ruby Mountains by mid-November, and blizzards regularly swept across the valleys, forcing Hank and Gunnar to remain close to home. They used the time to strengthen their bond, learning each other's habits, preferences, and histories. Gunnar told Hank about her childhood in Philadelphia, her parents' death from influenza, and her struggle to support herself afterward. Hank shared more about his own past, his father's drinking, his mother's early death, his decision to leave Ohio at 19 rather than follow his father's path into the mines. "I wanted something that was mine," he explained one evening as they sat before the fire. "Something I built with my own hands that no one could take away." "And you've done it," Gunnar observed, looking around the comfortable home he had created. "You should be proud." Hank's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I am, but it wasn't complete until you arrived." As Christmas approached, Gunnar threw herself into preparations, determined to make their first holiday together special. She baked cookies from her mother's recipes, sewed new curtains for the parlor, and secretly knitted Hank a scarf from wool she had ordered from the general store in Elko. Hank, too, was keeping secrets. Whenever Gunnar entered his study, he would hastily cover whatever he was working on, offering only a mysterious smile when she questioned him. On Christmas Eve, after a simple but delicious dinner, Hank led Gunnar to the parlor where a small pine tree stood decorated with paper ornaments and strings of cranberries. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a package wrapped in brown paper from behind the tree. Gunnar unwrapped it carefully to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden jewelry box. The top was inlaid with a pattern of stars in lighter wood, and when she opened it, a soft melody played "Beautiful Dreamer," one of her favorite songs. "Hank," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you make this?" He nodded, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "Been working on it since November. There's something else inside." Lifting the velvet lining of the jewelry box, Gunnar found a small envelope. Inside was a deed to the ranch with both their names listed as owners. I don't understand, she said, looking up at him in confusion. It's your home too, Hank explained. I want you to know that. If anything ever happens to me, the ranch is yours not just as my wife, but as my partner in every sense. Tears welled in Gunnar's eyes. In a society where women had few legal rights, where even their own wages legally belonged to their husbands, this gesture of equality was extraordinary. Thank you, she whispered, setting the box aside to embrace him. I don't know what to say. Say you'll dance with me, Hank suggested, rising and offering his hand. There was no music beyond the small box's melody, but they needed none as they swayed together in the firelight. Later that night, their relationship deepened further as Gunnar invited Hank to truly be her husband in every sense. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a mutual exploration and affirmation of the feelings that had grown between them over the past months. As they lay together afterward, Gunnar's head pillowed on Hank's chest. She felt a sense of peace she had never known before. I love you, she said, the words coming naturally without hesitation. Hank's arms tightened around her. And I love you, Gunnar Forrester. More than I ever thought possible. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The pastures turned green, calves were born, and Gunnar's garden began to flourish. In May, she discovered she was expecting their first child. When she told Hank, his face lit with a joy she had never seen before. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before setting her down with sudden concern. Should I not have done that? I don't want to hurt you or the baby, he fretted. Gunnar laughed, cupping his face in her hands. We're both fine. The baby won't arrive until late autumn. As her pregnancy progressed, Gunnar's place in the community of Elko grew more secure. The whispers about her hasty marriage to Hank after Jacob Thornton's death gradually faded, replaced by genuine acceptance as neighbors saw the obvious devotion between the couple. Abigail Stone, who had witnessed their wedding, became a particular friend, often riding out to the ranch to check on Gunnar and bring news from town. It was from Abigail that they learned Sheriff Parker had been replaced after losing the election to a younger man named Wilson. A blessing for you both, I'd say, Abigail remarked over tea. Parker never did seem to let go of his suspicions, though he couldn't prove anything. In September, as Gunnar entered her final months of pregnancy, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch, a young woman named Sarah Jensen, newly arrived from Chicago. She had come seeking information about Jacob Thornton. He was my cousin, she explained as Gunnar served coffee in the parlor. We weren't close, but when I heard about his death, I wanted to learn more. The new sheriff in town suggested I speak with you, Mrs. Forrester. Gunnar exchanged a glance with Hank, who nodded slightly. What would you like to know, Miss Jensen? Sarah hesitated. This may sound strange, but... Was Jacob married when he died? The sheriff mentioned something about a bride. Taking a deep breath, Gunnar told her story, the carefully edited version they had crafted for public consumption, omitting the violence and her flight. So you never actually lived with him, Sarah clarified. No, Gunnar confirmed. I arrived in town, and by unfortunate coincidence his cabin caught fire that very night when I went there seeking directions to the Forrester ranch. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. It's just, there was a letter from Jacob to my father. He mentioned having acquired a wife and that he expected to profit handsomely from the arrangement. She looked up, her expression troubled. It didn't sound like a normal marriage. Gunnar's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. Jacob and I corresponded for several months before I traveled west. Perhaps he had certain expectations that weren't quite realistic. Perhaps, Sarah agreed, though she didn't sound convinced. In any case, I'm glad things worked out for you, Mrs. Forrester. You and your husband seem very happy together. After Sarah left, Gunnar collapsed into Hank's arms, shaking. "Do you think she suspected something?" Hank stroked her hair soothingly. "Even if she did, there's no proof of anything. And from the sound of it, Jacob was involved in something unsavory. That letter she mentioned about profiting from the marriage, it makes me wonder if he had done this before." "Sheriff Parker mentioned a woman who disappeared," Gunnar remembered. "What if Jacob—" "Don't," Hank said firmly. "Don't torture yourself with what-ifs. Whatever Jacob did or didn't do, it's in the past now. We have our future to think about." He placed a hand on her rounded belly where their child grew. "This is what matters now." On a cold November morning, after 18 hours of labor attended by Abigail Stone and the town's midwife, Gunnar gave birth to a healthy son. They named him Thomas, after Hank's grandfather, with the middle name James in honor of Gunnar's father. "He's perfect," Hank whispered, cradling his son with awe. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and your eyes." Gunnar smiled tiredly. "It's too soon to know if his eyes will stay green. They might turn blue like yours. Either way, he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Hank declared, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Except for his mother." The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of joy and exhaustion. He was a good-natured baby, quick to smile and eager to explore as soon as he could crawl. Hank proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Thomas with him as he performed lighter chores around the ranch. By the time Thomas celebrated his first birthday, Gunnar was expecting their second child. This pregnancy was easier than the first, though chasing after a toddler while managing a household kept her constantly busy. In the spring of 1879, their daughter Elizabeth was born, completing their family. With her father's blue eyes and her mother's chestnut hair, she was a beautiful baby who quickly had Hank wrapped around her tiny finger. "She'll be a heartbreaker someday," he predicted as 3-year-old Thomas peered curiously at his new sister. "Like her mother," Gunnar teased. Hank leaned down to kiss her. "Exactly like her mother." As the children grew, so did the ranch. With careful management and hard work, Hank and Gunnar expanded their operation, adding more cattle and hiring 2 full-time hands to help with the increasing workload. They built a larger barn and added 2 rooms to the house to accommodate their growing family. Gunnar never forgot the circumstances that had brought her west, the desperation that had led her to answer Jacob Thornton's advertisement, the terror of that night in his cabin, the miraculous chance that had brought Hank into her life. But as the years passed, those memories receded, overshadowed by the joy and fulfillment she found in her life with Hank and their children. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Hank surprised Gunnar with a trip to San Francisco, something she had long dreamed of but never expected to experience. They left the children in Abigail's capable care and traveled by train to the coast. "I can't believe we're really here," Gunnar said as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room, gazing out at the bay where ships from around the world docked. "Believe it," Hank said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. At 42, his hair was beginning to silver at the temples, but he was still as strong and vital as the day they'd met. "You deserve to see the world, Gunnar." She turned in his embrace. "I have everything I need in you and our children. But this—" she gestured toward the panoramic view. "This is a wonderful gift." They spent a week exploring the city, attending the theater, dining in fine restaurants, and shopping for gifts to bring home to the children. On their last night, as they walked along the waterfront, Gunnar spotted a young woman disembarking from a steamship, looking lost and frightened. "She reminds me of myself," Gunnar murmured. "Coming to a strange place, not knowing what awaits." Hank squeezed her hand. "You were stronger than you knew." "I had to be," she replied. "And then I found you, and I didn't have to be strong alone anymore." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "That day I found you in the desert covered in ash, half dead from heat stroke. I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, Gunnar, you saved me too, from loneliness, from a life half lived." Tears glistened in Gunnar's eyes. "We saved each other then." "I suppose we did," Hank agreed, pulling her close. "And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They returned to the ranch refreshed and renewed, greeted by the exuberant welcome of Thomas and Elizabeth, who had grown seemingly inches taller in just a week. As life settled back into its familiar rhythm, Gunnar reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment of completeness. From the desperate young woman who had fled Philadelphia seeking any escape from poverty, to the terrified bride escaping a violent husband, to the beloved wife and mother she had become, it had been a journey marked by both tragedy and blessing. One evening, as she and Hank sat on the porch watching Thomas and Elizabeth play in the yard, 7-year-old Thomas came running up with a handful of wildflowers. "For you, Mama," he said, presenting them proudly. "Thank you, sweetheart," Gunnar replied, inhaling their sweet fragrance. "They're beautiful. Papa says you came to him covered in ashes, like Cinderella," Thomas announced, climbing onto the porch swing between his parents. "And he cleaned you up and married you, and now we're a family." Gunnar looked at Hank in surprise. They had never told the children the circumstances of their meeting. Hank shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "It's a good story. Better than the truth, maybe." "No," Gunnar said softly, reaching across their son to take Hank's hand. "The truth is better because it's ours." In the distance, the sun was setting behind the Ruby Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elizabeth's laughter floated across the yard as she chased a butterfly, her dark curls bouncing. "Yes," Hank agreed, his fingers tightening around hers. "It's ours." And in that moment, with her family gathered close and the ranch thriving around them, Gunnar knew that the fire that had once threatened to destroy her had instead forged a new beginning, one built on truth, courage, and a love as vast and enduring as the Nevada sky above them. The years continued to pass, marking the rhythm of ranch life with the changing seasons. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's steady nature and his mother's quick intelligence. By 16, he was working alongside Hank as a full partner in the ranch operations, showing a natural aptitude for breeding and managing their expanding herd. Elizabeth, 2 years younger, blossomed into a spirited girl who excelled at school and had her heart set on attending college in California, a dream Gunnar and Hank fully supported, having put aside money each year for their children's education. "Times are changing," Gunnar observed one evening as she and Hank reviewed the accounts in his study. "When I came west, a woman had few options beyond marriage or teaching. Now Elizabeth talks of becoming a doctor." Hank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "She has your determination." "I wouldn't bet against her." Their lives were not without challenges. A drought in the summer of 1890 threatened the cattle, forcing Hank to drive the herd farther into the mountains to find adequate grazing. Gunnar contracted pneumonia the following winter, leaving her bedridden for weeks while the family anxiously tended to her. But for each hardship, there seemed to be a corresponding blessing. The drought ended with autumn rains that replenished the streams and wells. Gunnar recovered fully from her illness, her appreciation for life and family deepened by the experience. And always, at the center of everything, was the bond between Gunnar and Hank, a partnership that had begun as an arrangement of convenience and deepened into a love that anchored them both through every storm. In 1896, as they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, Hank surprised Gunnar with a special gift, the deed to a small house in Elko. "What's this for?" she asked, studying the document in confusion. For us, Hank explained. Not now, but someday. When Thomas is ready to take over the main operation of the ranch, we'll still be close enough to help when needed, but he hesitated, suddenly uncertain. I thought you might like to be closer to town as we get older, more convenience, less isolation. Gunnar considered the idea. There was wisdom in it. The harsh winters were becoming more difficult to endure as they aged, and being closer to the doctor and other amenities would be practical. But the ranch had been her sanctuary, her true home for 20 years. It's a wonderful gift, she said carefully. But only if you're there with me. Relief softened Hank's features. Always. Wherever you are, that's where I want to be. The house in town became their occasional retreat, a place to stay when winter storms made travel difficult or when they wanted to attend social events in Elko. But the ranch remained their primary home, the place where they had built their life together. Thomas, at 21, took on increasing responsibility for the ranch operations. He had his father's skill with cattle and his mother's head for business, a combination that served him well as the ranch continued to prosper. Elizabeth departed for San Francisco in 1897 to attend medical school, her parents' pride tempered only by their sense of loss at her absence. Her letters home were filled with excitement about her studies and the wider world she was discovering. She won't come back, Gunnar predicted wistfully after reading Elizabeth's latest letter, which described her fascination with the modern hospital where she was training. Maybe not to stay, Hank agreed, but she'll visit, and perhaps someday when Elko grows large enough to need another doctor, she'll consider it. They were proven right on both counts. Elizabeth thrived in San Francisco, eventually marrying a fellow doctor and establishing a practice there. But she returned to Nevada at least once a year, bringing her husband and later their 2 children to spend time with their grandparents. Thomas, meanwhile, found love closer to home. In 1900, he married Ruth Bennett, the daughter of Dr. Bennett, who had examined Gunnar on her wedding day so many years before. The young couple built a small house on the ranch property, expanding the Forrester presence on the land Hank had worked so hard to develop. In 1902, Gunnar became a grandmother when Ruth gave birth to twins, a boy they named Henry after his grandfather, and a girl they called Grace. Watching Hank cradle his namesake, his face alight with joy, Gunnar felt her heart might burst with happiness. "Remember when you found me in the desert?" she asked that night as they sat on their porch, enjoying the cool evening air. "Did you ever imagine this life we would build?" Hank considered her question, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness. "Not in detail," he admitted. "But I knew, even then, that there was something special about you, something worth fighting for." Gunnar leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that their story, begun in ash and desperation, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. As they entered their 60s, Hank and Gunnar gradually stepped back from the daily operations of the ranch, though they remained actively involved in planning and decision-making. They spent more time in their house in town, enjoying the convenience and community it offered. Hank joined the town council, while Gunnar volunteered at the school, teaching young girls to sew and read. In 1916, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together 4 generations of family. Elizabeth returned from San Francisco with her husband and children. Thomas and Ruth were there with the twins, now 16, and their younger siblings. And Henry, their oldest grandchild, proudly introduced his fiancée, a schoolteacher from Reno. The celebration was held at the ranch, the place where it had all begun. Tables were set up under the cottonwood trees, laden with food prepared by Gunnar, Ruth, and the other women of the family. Lanterns hung from the branches, casting a golden glow over the gathering as the sun set. After dinner, Thomas rose to offer a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us the meaning of love, perseverance, and partnership. 40 years together is quite an achievement, especially considering how they started," Elizabeth added with a smile. Mother arriving in Elko as a mail-order bride, only to end up with father instead. It was the story they had eventually shared with their children, a sanitized version that omitted the violence and terror of those early days, focusing instead on the unlikely circumstances that had brought Gunnar and Hank together. "I'd say it worked out rather well," Hank remarked, his arm around Gunnar's shoulders. "Better than well," Gunnar agreed, gazing around at their assembled family. "Beyond anything I could have dreamed." Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the younger generation had retired to their respective homes, Gunnar and Hank walked hand in hand through the quiet ranch house. It had evolved over the years, with additions and improvements, but the core remained the same, the place where they had begun their life together. In the bedroom that had been theirs for so many years, Gunnar paused by the dresser where her jewelry box still sat, the one Hank had crafted for her that first Christmas. She opened it, and the familiar melody of "Beautiful Dreamer" filled the room. "It still plays perfectly," she marveled. "Good craftsmanship lasts," Hank said, coming to stand behind her. "Like a good marriage." Gunnar turned to face him, studying the beloved features that had aged alongside her own. The dark hair was now completely silver, the face more lined, but the blue eyes were as kind and steady as ever. 40 years, she said softly. "Sometimes it seems impossible that so much time has passed." "And sometimes," Hank replied, taking her hands in his, "it seems like only yesterday that I found you in the desert, covered in ash, half dead from heat and exhaustion." "You cleaned my wounds," Gunnar remembered, "and offered your name." "Best decision I ever made," Hank said simply. She leaned forward to kiss him, a gesture as natural after 40 years as breathing. "Mine too." As they prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of long practice, Gunnar reflected on the strange, winding path of her life. From the desperate young woman who had fled Philadelphia to the mail-order bride who escaped violence, to the wife, mother, and grandmother she had become, it had been a journey marked by both hardship and joy. But through it all, there had been Hank, steady, kind, and unwavering in his love and support. The man who had found her at her lowest moment and offered not just help, but dignity. Who had given her his name and, in doing so, given her a future she could never have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Hank asked as they settled into bed, his arm finding its familiar place around her waist. "How fortunate I am," Gunnar replied. "How all the pain and fear led me to you, to this life we've built." Hank's arm tightened around her. "We built it together," he reminded her, "every step of the way." "Yes," she agreed, nestling closer to him. "Together." Outside their window, the Nevada sky stretched vast and star-filled above the land they had tended for 4 decades. The ranch was quiet. The cattle settled for the night, the cottonwood trees rustling softly in the gentle breeze. And in their bed, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for countless nights before, Gunnar and Hank Forrester drifted toward sleep, secure in the knowledge that the fire that had once threatened to consume her had instead forged a bond that would endure beyond a lifetime, a love story written in ash and courage, in perseverance and unwavering devotion, in the heart of the American West.